Jon Snow stood on the slimy wooden pier in Eastwatch by the sea, staring at the vessel that would bear him away from the Seven Kingdoms. He had never seen such a pathetic, battered ship in all his life. Its sails patched with tar-stained cloth, its hull listing heavily to starboard even in the calm of the protected harbor. The boards underfoot were slippery with seaweed and brine, and the air stung with that raw tang that set the nerves on edge. A single seagull circled overhead, crying out in a lonely, mocking call. The bleak sight of it all matched Jon's mood perfectly. He was exiled, sent away under the threat of death should he ever return. The North, the Wall, the memory of Winterfell's halls, all of it had once been his life. But everything changed the day he saw the new realm he had helped forge turn against him. Perhaps he had been naive to assume his part in the wars was finished. Perhaps he should have known that in the Game of Thrones, debts lingered like ghosts, returning to haunt a man when he least expected. Now, the cost of his own decisions and the burdens he still carried had led him here, at the edge of the world, about to embark on the strangest journey of his life. He clutched a small sack at his waist. Within it rattled a few coins, barely enough silver stags to keep him fed for a month, and a single meager memento, a scrap of pale cloth embroidered with the stark direwolf, a farewell from a half-sister he loved dearly. Jon pressed his lips together and exhaled, curling his gloved fingers around the token. It was a tender gesture, but one that made his throat tighten. Winterfell was behind him, almost as distant as the innocence of his youth. A harsh voice rang out, shattering his reverie. "You coming aboard or not?" The ship's captain was a grizzled man with a stooped back and a burned scar across one cheek. He glowered at Jon. As if Jon's presence were an inconvenience he had not the patience to accommodate. Jon glanced at the gray sky. The day was quickly bleeding into twilight. The watchfires along the coast were already being lit, flickers of brightness in the gloom. Soon, the dark waters that lapped at the boat's hull would turn black and bottomless. He took the first step onto the boarding plank, the wood creaking under his boots. The captain gave a grunt of acknowledgement and gestured towards the stern. "Find yourself a corner and keep out of the way. If you're here to sail, we leave on the next tide. Won't be no turning back if you change your mind, bastard of the North." There was no warmth in the man's words. Jon found himself unbothered by it. He'd seen more than enough coldness in his life to know a man's courtesy did not necessarily speak for his heart. "Aye," Jon said quietly. He made his way forward, ignoring the curious stares of the few deckhands. No doubt they'd heard talk of him. Everyone had heard talk of him. The dead man who came back to life, the king in the north who renounced his crown, the Targaryen heir who gave up the throne. So many titles, so many stories. He was weary of it all. He ducked beneath a frayed rope and found his way below decks. The air there was foul and stale, tinged with mildew and the lingering smell of rotting fish. Hammocks hung from the beams, tattered lengths of canvas that threatened to spill a sleeper onto the planks. He picked the emptiest corner he could find and unrolled a thin blanket of his own. The wood beneath him was damp, but it was better than the cramped hammocks had shared while at sea before. His time traveling to and from the Wall had acquainted him with the fact that ships were seldom pleasant. This one was no exception. The ship lurched into motion sooner than he expected, and through the tiny port in the hull, he saw the harbor fade. First the movement of lights on the pier, then the shape of towers. Finally, the gloom swallowed all signs of Eastwatch. He was truly alone, truly cast out. With a small sigh, he settled onto his blanket and tried to ease into sleep. When dreams came, they took him back to cold nights on the Wall. He saw Ghost, his white direwolf, sprinting across the ice. He heard the cries of the horn summoning the watchman, felt the wind raking across his face until it seemed to flay the skin from his cheeks. Then the wind shifted, grew hot, and a roar echoed in his mind. He saw wings, vast and leathery, blocking out the sun. He felt fire rather than cold, and the flames coalesced into the shape of a dragon with eyes that glowed like molten gold. Jon woke with a start, the deck rocking beneath him, sweat beating at his temple. The dream left his heart hammering in his chest. He was restless, too tense to lie still. Sliding to his feet, he climbed the steps to the deck, where the air was cold and briny. A half-moon hung in a cloud-strewn sky. Waves hissed and churned around them. One of the deckhands, an older woman with wiry hair pulled into a tight knot, leaned on the railing, spitting occasionally into the dark water. She glanced up at John but said nothing. He joined her at the rail, letting the salt spray patter his face. Behind him, the captain stood at the helm, his attention riveted on the horizon, though in the darkness, there was little to see aside from the vague silhouettes of waves. John was no stranger to the sea, but rarely had he sailed in such anxious circumstances. At least once, he asked himself if exile was truly the only option, if some measure of forgiveness or redemption could have been found in the north or across the seven kingdoms. But those thoughts soon drifted away like the receding tide. The will of those in power had been made clear, and John's conscience would not let him challenge it. He turned his gaze forward. Tomorrow was uncertain. He had heard the rumors, half-insane tales of old Valyria, the realm long lost to the doom. People said it was haunted by ghosts and lethal plagues. That was where the captain had agreed to take him. It was the only place left in the known world that might grant John the obscurity he sought. Who would come looking for him in a land rumored to curse all who set foot there? He remained at the rail until the hours grew small, then returned below. He slept again, this time without dreaming, and woke to the call of the sailors as they hoisted the sails. Over the next few days, John's life fell into a tedious pattern. He helped scrub the decks, pulled rigging when ordered, and otherwise did his best to avoid conflict. The crew was surly but not violent, a band of misfits in search of coin or anonymity. In their own way, they reminded him of the Black Brothers of the Night's Watch, those who had chosen the wall to escape dire fates. John found no friends among them, yet there was a sort of quiet acceptance in their presence. They rarely asked questions, and he rarely volunteered answers. They sailed southeast, past the Bay of Seals, around the Fingers, and onward through the Stepstones. The weather grew warmer with each league traveled, and John found it odd to shed his heavy furs. He had grown so accustomed to the biting cold that the sun felt alien on his shoulders. Days turned to weeks. The provisions dwindled to stale bread and pickled fish. The water barrels turned sour, and the men glowered at the horizon as if it insulted them. Still, they pressed on, guided by the captain's battered charts and a fierce determination to claim whatever reward had been promised him upon completion of his task. John never asked the man about it. Money, perhaps, or maybe something darker. He had seen enough in his travels to know many captains bartered in secrets as well as coin. One twilight, the sea shimmered like molten glass as the sun bled into the water. The sails overhead flapped in a lazy wind. John, perched near the bow, was dozing against a coil of rope, lulled by the rhythmic rocking. He stirred at a sudden hush that fell across the ship. The chatter of the crew died away, replaced by tense whispers. Standing, John saw the captain at the helm, his scarred face rigid. At first, John thought pirates might be on the horizon, or a monstrous sea creature, a kraken or something worse. But when he followed the direction of the captain's glare, his heart caught in his throat. There in the distance, half shrouded by mist, rose the broken spires and jagged silhouettes that could only be the remnants of Valyria. Worn by centuries of storms and the ever-crumbling weight of the doom, the city soared in odd, disjointed shapes. Collapsed archways, half-submerged towers, causeways snapped like brittle bones, all traced against a sky grown suddenly dark. Even from afar, John sensed an eerie presence, as if the very stones breathed malevolence. A tremor of unease ran through him. The captain gave a quiet order to his crew to haul in the sails. The battered ship drifted on the current, gliding towards the shattered coastline. "We'll anchor outside the city," he growled. "No further. Not a stroke further." "Madam Samra." John nodded. He had not expected them to ferry him deeper. No one wanted to brave the smoking sea or the labyrinth of broken canals, rumored to be teeming with disease and monstrous creatures. Still, it was not enough simply to stand at the outskirts. The terms of his exile demanded he vanish into old Valyria, never to return. He swallowed his dread, thinking of how the city's gloom seemed to swallow the last rays of the setting sun. It was an accursed place, if ever one existed. The deckhands lowered a small rowboat over the side, and the captain turned to John, fixing him with a hard stare. "I've brought you this far. Take some advice, bastard. Don't linger. Whatever you're after, find it fast and get out. Assuming you can get out at all." John climbed into the rowboat with his sparse belongings, a sword at his hip, Longclaw, the faithful blade forged of Valyrian steel, along with a half-full waterskin and a pack of supplies that would not last him more than a few days. The rowboat descended with a jarring splash. Once the lines were released, John began rowing towards the ashen coast, the ship's hull receding behind him. A chill wind skimmed across the water, stinging his face. It felt like the breath of an ancient curse. He passed chunks of stone that might once have been statues or pillars, now tumbled into the shallows. The water took on a greenish hue, swirling with sediment, or perhaps something far more sinister. John rowed in silence, feeling an odd pull in his veins that he could not name. It was as though the blood of the dragon within him recognized this place, this lost cradle of Targaryen power. He tried not to dwell on it, focusing instead on the rhythmic pull of the oars. At last, the prow scraped against a slope of wet black rocks. Nearby, a cracked marble quay jutted from the water's edge, leading into what must have been a canal once. Now it was choked with rubble and half-ruined masonry. With effort, John hauled the rowboat onto the rocks and stepped onto the shattered quay. The air smelled of sulfur and damp decay. Every stone was slick with algae or mold. Ruined buildings loomed on either side, their windows yawning like empty sockets in a skull. John had grown used to places of death and desolation. He had stood on fields strewn with corpses, had walked beneath the remnants of a castle ravaged by war. But this was something else entirely, a devastation so total, so ancient, that it felt outside the bounds of natural destruction. He thought of the stories of the Doom, how in a single day and night, the grand civilization of the Valyrians had been swallowed by fire and chaos, leaving only these ruined remains. He thought of the Targaryen line escaping the cataclysm, forging a new destiny in Westeros. And now, centuries later, here he was, a son of that line, exiled to the skeleton of his ancestors' glory. He took a moment to gather himself. The fading light revealed a narrow street beyond the quay, lined with crumbling walls. At intervals he glimpsed fragments of the famed Valyrian architecture, serpentine columns carved with dragons, mosaic floors shattered into thousands of glittering shards. Above, the sky had turned a murky red, like embers glowing behind thick smoke. Though the sun had not fully set, the pall of the place cast everything in twilight. With careful steps, he started forward. His boots slid on the damp stone, and he braced himself on a pillar that had toppled at an angle. Whispering wind curled through the hollow shells of buildings, sometimes sounding almost like voices. John paused more than once, straining to discern if he heard real movement, or only the sigh of drafts and the echo of his own pulse. One step at a time, he reminded himself, remembering the advice of the captain. Do what must be done. Survive. If he hoped for any measure of safety, he would need shelter for the night. Though old Valyria was rumored to be a labyrinth of curses and hidden terrors, it was also vast. At least in the immediate area, it seemed deserted. He chose a structure that still had most of its walls intact, perhaps once a merchant's home or a small workshop. Its door was long gone, leaving only a charred frame, leaning on twisted hinges. The interior was dark, but as he stepped inside, his footfall kicked up a swirl of ash. A large portion of the ceiling had collapsed, allowing enough of the dim, reddened sky to peer through. Broken beams littered the floor. Furniture had rotted away, leaving only lumps of discolored wood. In the back corner, though, there was a small space mostly shielded by the remains of a stone arch. John decided it was as good a place as any to wait out the night. He cleared debris as best he could, mindful of each board for fear of scorpions or other poisonous creatures that might have made a nest. He took a moment to rummage through what remained of the structure. Most of it had been looted or destroyed centuries ago, so there was nothing of real value left. He did find a rusted iron pot that was only half eaten by corrosion. It might hold water, should he find any fresh supply. Setting it aside, John shed his pack and slumped against the wall. The evening air was warm enough that he needed no fire, but he felt uneasy at the prospect of darkness closing in. The hours dragged, each minute stretching like taffy. At times, he thought he heard scratching along the rubble outside, but whenever he peered out the doorframe, he saw only shadows. The wind's moan grew stronger. He chewed on the last of his day's ration, a bit of hardtack and dried salt cod. It tasted like sawdust, but it was sustenance. Finally, at what he assumed was true night, he let exhaustion take him. Sleep did not come easily, but it found him eventually. Dreadful visions haunted him. There were images of a city swallowed by flame, dragons screaming in the sky as towers cracked and fell. He saw armies of the dead marching through the smoky haze, heard the clang of swords, the roar of wildfire. Then, through the chaos, he glimpsed a pale figure with silver-gold hair reaching out to him. It might have been Daenerys, or perhaps some long-dead Valyrian noble. He strained to see more, but the vision dissolved into darkness, and he woke with his heart pounding, the taste of smoke in his mouth. Morning, if it could be called that, brought a heavy gloom. The sky above was choked with lowering clouds, tinted greenish-gray. John crawled out into the open, carefully picking his way over shattered stone. He walked to the edge of the canal. The water was brackish and foul, swirling with a scummy film that gave off a pungent stench. This place was a graveyard. It did not take an expert to see that any traveler foolish enough to rely on local water sources would be courting death. He used a bit of his precious drinking water to wash some of the grit from his face. Then he pressed on deeper into the city, though he had no real direction in mind. Here and there, wide avenues branched off, leading to grand plazas with toppled statues of dragons. In one plaza, he saw what might have been a temple, its roof long gone. Its columns, carved to resemble twisting wyverns, reared up on either side, and the floor was cracked mosaic, depicting a swirl of vibrant colors that time had rendered mostly dull. John paused at the threshold of that temple, a strange pressure tugging at his chest. He thought he heard a faint sound, like the echo of chanting from centuries past. But there was only silence, save for the wind. He felt the presence of old Valyria in every breath he took, as if the city itself were a living entity. The roads were empty, no sign of man or animal or anything else. It was an oppressive solitude that made him hyper-aware of his every movement. He recalled the legends of men who had ventured here, only to succumb to some creeping sickness. Yet he also remembered that Jorah Mormont had once braved these ruins, and he'd returned changed, though not entirely lost. Jorah had contracted grayscale here, and the disease almost claimed him. John wondered if the fabled stone men still lurked in the deeper channels, if they roamed aimlessly, lost to madness. He would have to be careful near any waterways. One misstep, and it could be the end of him. The day stretched on as John explored. The architecture told a story of greatness. Walls carved with stylized dragons, soaring arches that had partially collapsed, hidden courtyards with silent fountains. Every so often, he glimpsed remnants of mosaic floors or murals in chipped paint, scenes of Valyrian conquests, their dragon lords astride monstrous beasts. He felt an odd stirring in his chest whenever he saw the images of dragons. It was more than just Targaryen heritage. He had ridden a dragon once. He had known the terrifying power and fierce majesty of those creatures. That memory felt distant now, like a dream half forgotten. By midday, if the murky gloom could be called day, he discovered a narrow lane that sloped downwards, leading to a vast rift in the city's foundation. The ground had split open, presumably during the Doom. Giant shards of stone jutted up like the teeth of a colossal maw. At the bottom, there was darkness, a cavern or cleft that disappeared into the depths below the city. A hot wind exhaled from it, smelling of minerals and ancient fires. He could not see more than a few steps into that blackness, but he felt a spark of curiosity. The stories said that Valyria had been built upon a network of volcanic tunnels. The Valyrians had harnessed the molten rivers beneath the earth to forge their peerless steel. Perhaps that was where the true secrets lay. John had no torch, and no desire to fall into some pit, yet he could not entirely banish the allure of that place. Standing at the edge, he felt a tremor in his limbs, an echo of that dream where he had seen dragons. It made no sense to go below, not without preparation. But the call was there, an insistent whisper at the back of his mind. He tore himself away and continued on, determined to find safer ground for the night. Time crept slowly, marked only by the grumble of his empty stomach and the ache in his legs. He rummaged through any half-intact structures, hoping to find stale grain, dried provisions, or anything edible. But centuries of decay and scavenging had left little. He found a broken amphora that smelled faintly of olives, a cupboard of rotting shelves, a sack of something turned to dust. At last, in the remains of what might have been a wine cellar, he discovered a sealed jar that, when pried open, revealed salted fish. The smell was horrendous, but it was not spoiled. He coughed at the pungency and forced down a few mouthfuls. It tasted vile, but it was nourishment. He sealed it again and took it with him, grateful for any sustenance. As evening approached, he found a building that provided somewhat better shelter. A small stone dome, mostly intact, with only a few cracks. It might have been a bathhouse or a private crypt. The purpose was unclear. A single entrance opened onto a short corridor that led to a circular chamber with a wide hole in the center of the floor. Carefully peering down, John saw stagnant water perhaps 6 or 7 feet below. If it was once a bathing pool, it had since become a dank pit of greenish liquid. He wrinkled his nose at the smell and settled against the curved wall, relieved at least to have protection overhead should a storm roll in. He dozed through the first half of the night, stirring each time a gust of wind rattled the broken stones. At one point, he woke abruptly, hearing a scraping noise somewhere nearby. He froze, hand on Longclaw's hilt, straining to listen. For a long time there was only silence. Then, the faintest rustle again, as if something moved just outside the dome. John rose, crouching, carefully approaching the entrance. He peered out into the darkness, where the faint glow of the moon had emerged from the cloud cover. At first he saw nothing, only twisted pillars and rubble. But then his eyes adjusted, and he caught a glimpse of a hunched shape moving at the edge of a collapsed wall. It was too large to be an ordinary cat or scavenger. Human? Or a stone man? The figure seemed to slink away, its movements jerky. John felt his pulse quicken. He did not call out. Instead, he watched until the shape slipped into the deeper shadows. Only then did he retreat into the dome. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or perhaps not. Either way, the reminder was clear. He was not alone here, no matter how empty the streets seemed. When morning came, the shape he had seen lingered in his mind. He continued exploring with more caution, keeping a hand near his sword. Clouds of ash drifted in some places, carried on swirling eddies of hot air that rose from the fissures in the ground. The city felt even more oppressive than before, as though the restless spirits of Valyria had grown aware of his presence. He followed the line of broken canals, winding through the labyrinth. Occasionally, the path became impassable, forcing him to backtrack or scramble over piles of stone. He was about to scale one such pile when he heard a deep rumbling in the distance. It sounded like thunder, but the sky was relatively clear. The noise came again, more like a long, resonant groan. A tremor moved underfoot, and he hastily stumbled backwards as chunks of rubble slid away from beneath him. For a moment, he feared an earthquake was imminent. Then silence returned, as if whatever force had stirred had gone back to slumber. Disconcerted, he moved on, resolved not to remain near any unstable terrain. By midday he found an ancient courtyard overshadowed by the half-collapsed skeleton of a large building. Perhaps once it had been a palace or a center of administration, for the approach was lined with battered statues of dragons perched on pillars. John stepped cautiously among them, the grand columns leaning precariously above. Each statue had suffered from centuries of weather and cataclysm. Wings broken, tails snapped, faces eroded to featureless lumps. Yet the effect was still impressive. At the far end of the courtyard, massive doors of corroded bronze hung off their hinges, leading into darkness. He approached one door, its surface emblazoned with the faint outlines of dragons in flight, swirling in a hammered pattern. Most of the detail was lost to tarnish. Carefully, He slipped through the gap. Stale air greeted him, smelling of centuries of dust. The interior was vast, the ceiling arched overhead with a surprising amount of intact stone. Shafts of dim light speared through cracks in the roof, illuminating broad steps that led to a dais or throne-like arrangement at the far end. The walls were lined with niches that might once have held statues or urns. Now, they stood empty. John could almost imagine how this hall must have looked in Valyria's prime, lit by torches or glowing orbs of some magical design. The lords and ladies of the city gathered in silken finery, speaking in the old tongue. He wondered if they had convened here for dire matters in the days before the doom, if they had tried to quell the fires that would soon consume them all. The hush pressed on him like a weight. Only the faint rustle of his footsteps broke the silence. He was halfway across the floor when he paused. Something about the dais drew his attention. The air above it seemed to shimmer, as if stirred by heat. He moved closer, heart pounding with an odd anticipation. The dais was carved from a darker stone, flecked with silver that glinted in the beams of light. At its center stood a pedestal, cracked down one side, but still upright. Upon it rested a lump of dull grayish material, almost like molten rock that had cooled into an amorphous shape. From a distance, John thought it might be just a chunk of debris, but as he neared, he recognized the familiar oval curve, the faint ridged pattern. His breath caught. It looked like a dragon's egg. He did not dare to believe it at first. He had seen dragon eggs before. 3 had hatched in Denris' hands. Their shells were vibrant, shimmering with color. This one looked lifeless, caked in soot or ash. Yet, the shape was unmistakable. Slowly, carefully, he laid a hand upon it. The surface was rough and cold. But as he pressed his palm, he detected a subtle warmth beneath the crust. Could it be his own body heat reflected back? Perhaps. But something in him whispered otherwise. His pulse thundered in his ears. If this truly was a dragon egg, it was unimaginable. The idea that an egg had survived here, hidden in the ruins, was like a spark in the darkness. Dragons had been the heart of Valyrian might, and here was a relic of that ancient power. Denris had brought dragons back into the world, yet her dragons had died in the wars, or so he had believed. The memory of Rhaegal's green wings flashed through his mind. He thought of Drogon's black scales glinting in the sun, of how he had soared across the skies on the back of a living dragon. The idea that another might remain, a new dragon that could rise from the ashes, sent chills through him. For a long time, he simply stood there, hand resting on that possible egg, absorbing the enormity of it. The doom of Valyria had not snuffed out every flame, it seemed. Yet, this was only one egg. And it might be dead, a fossil left over from a bygone era. Even if it were still viable, could he hatch it? Would it bring more tragedy to the world? He had seen how the power of dragons could unite or destroy. He had seen how it had twisted good hearts with the intoxication of dominion. He closed his eyes, exhaling. Perhaps fate had led him here. He was a Targaryen, whether he wished to be or not. He wrapped the egg carefully in a rag he pulled from his pack, ensuring he did not chip the shell on the pedestal's rough edges. He set it gently inside his pack, though it weighed more than he expected. Solid, full of potential. He remained crouched for a moment, trying to steady his shaking hands. In that instant, the hush of the great hall seemed to deepen, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Then came a sound that made his heart freeze, a faint scraping echo, but not from outside. It came from deeper within the building, behind the dais, as if something had stirred at the edge of darkness. John rose slowly, hand on Longclaw's pommel. The scraping sound came again, a slow, rhythmic rasp like claws against stone. He tried to peer through the gloom, but the light was too dim. His instincts screamed to run, to escape before whatever lurked in these depths found him. But curiosity, or perhaps some sense of destiny, rooted him to the spot. He took a step towards the dais, then another. The sound paused. The silence was thunderous. Then, in a rush, a shape slithered out from behind the broken pedestal. In the flicker of light, John saw something that momentarily made his mind reel. A reptilian form, slender and lithe, with a long neck and tail. It was small, perhaps the size of a large dog, but its limbs and the outline of folded wings were unmistakable. Scales of a deep bronze covered its body, flecked with red near the ridges of its spine. Two sharp eyes caught the light like glowing coals. A dragon, a living, breathing dragon in old Valyria. Jon's breath stuttered in his chest. He had ridden Drogon, seen Rhaegal and Viserion. But to find another dragon here, hidden beneath the ruins of the civilization that had birthed them, it was beyond belief. The creature hissed, a low, rattling sound, bearing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It reminded Jon of the hunts in the far north, when a lone wolf would encounter a strange presence in its territory. Carefully, Jon raised his empty hand, palm outward, in a gesture of caution and peace. The dragon's tail lashed, stirring dust across the floor. Its eyes flicked to Jon's hand, then to his sword, then back to his eyes. The intelligence in that gaze was clear, but also a feral wariness. This was no tame beast, no newly hatched infant. It had survived on its own, in a place bereft of men, in a land of curses. The fact that it lived at all was extraordinary. Jon took a slow step back, not wishing to provoke an attack. The dragon hissed again, the small spines along its neck flaring. He felt the heat of its breath. Even in this smaller specimen, the flames would be deadly. He murmured softly, recalling how Daenerys had sometimes spoken to her dragons in Valyrian. Though he knew only snippets of the language, he tried a few soft phrases, the syllables sounding foreign on his tongue. The creature cocked its head, listening. It did not lunge forward or retreat, as if uncertain whether to shred him or ignore him. Jon inhaled, adrenaline coursing through him. This moment held a fragile tension. He wondered if this dragon was alone, or if more lurked in the depths. The notion that an entire clutch might exist in the city's hollows sent a tremor of excitement through him, but also fear. Dragons were not easily tamed, nor did he wish to become a new conqueror. He only wanted to survive, to understand, to find some purpose beyond the endless cycle of war. He eased back another step, slowly turning. The dragon gave a short, guttural grunt, stepping forward onto the dais. Its claws clicked on the stone. Jon kept his head low, not meeting its gaze directly, hoping to convey submission. He circled around the dais, stepping carefully, never letting the dragon out of his sight. The creature mirrored his movement, pivoting to keep him in view, wings rustling as though it prepared to spring if needed. A standoff. Jon's heart pounded. In a cautious, deliberate motion, he laid a hand on the hilt of Longclaw, but did not draw it, letting the dragon see his intention to remain peaceful. He continued to move towards the corridor he had entered from, measuring each step so as not to spook the beast. The dragon let out a low growl, but it did not charge. Jon could see the ripple of its powerful muscles beneath the scales. At the threshold he paused, glancing back. The dragon had advanced to the edge of the dais, tail coiling around the pedestal. Even in the dimness, Jon saw something else that made him inhale sharply. There, nestled behind the dragon, were two more oval shapes, dull and ashen, partly covered by a scattering of rubble. More eggs. Possibly more siblings waiting to hatch. Or perhaps they were the remains of a clutch. He felt a surge of awe and pity. The dragon was defending them as any mother or father might guard its young. Yet how long had it been here alone among the ruins? The ache in Jon's chest was palpable. He thought of Rhaegal, of the bond he once shared, and an unfamiliar sense of kinship welled up in him. But he could not stay. Not like this, not unprepared. If he was to survive, if he was to help these creatures, or even learn from them, he would need more supplies, more understanding. Without another word, he slipped through the doorway. The dragon did not pursue, though he felt its eyes on his back. Outside, the oppressive heat and gloom of Valyria wrapped around him once more. He exhaled in a shudder, trying to quiet the tremor in his hands. An egg sat in his pack, a discovery worth kingdoms. And behind him, in that shattered hall, lived a creature out of myth. He thought again of his exile, of the men who had cast him out. If they only knew what he had found. Then he shook his head, resuming his cautious steps through the courtyard of broken dragon statues. Better for them not to know. Better for the world not to know. Knowledge of living dragons had a way of drawing greed and destruction in equal measure. Still, the question loomed. What was he meant to do with such a discovery? The memory of Daenerys's fierce determination surfaced in his mind. She had believed herself destined to break the wheel of tyranny, yet fate had twisted that path in blood. Jon's stomach knotted with guilt and sorrow. Perhaps the old world was gone, and with it, the illusions of grandeur. But was there a new purpose hidden in these ruins? An echo of hope in a doomed place? He could not answer yet. But he knew, as he stood in that courtyard with the weight of the egg in his pack, that his exile had led him to a perilous crossroad. He sensed the threads of destiny tugging him deeper, calling him to unravel the secrets that had survived the doom. Would he find redemption here, or only a new horror to unleash? The city was silent. The only response was the whisper of the wind through the ruins, carrying the faint scent of ash and the memory of dragons. Gritting his teeth, he braced himself. Night would come soon, and he would need shelter again. But the day's revelations had altered his perspective. He was not merely a lone wanderer in a cursed land. He was a Targaryen, scion of the blood of the dragon. And in the heart of old Valyria, the dragons were not all gone. He pressed on through the street of crumbling columns, every sense alive to the possibility that he was being watched, followed. Whether by that dragon, or by something else, he did not know. The idea that he might encounter more such creatures both thrilled and terrified him. His exhaustion weighed on him, but his mind raced, trying to form a plan. Perhaps he would attempt to communicate with the beast, to earn its trust, if such a thing was even possible. Or perhaps he should attempt to leave, to preserve the secret and spare the world more fire and blood. For now the night was pressing in, and he needed a haven from the shifting rubble and unknown threats. He found a half-intact tower near what might have once been a wide boulevard. After checking for hidden dangers and ensuring the steps were stable, he climbed to the second level where part of the floor remained. There, behind a toppled piece of masonry, he settled as best he could. With slow deliberation, he removed the dragon egg from his pack. In the dying light that trickled through the tower's cracks, he examined it. The shell was etched with subtle ridges in patterns that must have been exquisite in its prime. Now ash and soot dulled its surface. He felt a warmth beneath his fingertips again, faint but unmistakable. A trembling hope blossomed in his chest, mingled with fear. Memories of dragonfire and the sweet, wild exhilaration of flight rushed through him. Carefully, he wrapped the egg again, setting it aside. Outside, the wind carried a distant rumble, the same subterranean groan he had heard before. The city seemed to shift in its sleep, an ancient titan, stirring. Jon bowed his head, exhaustion dragging at him, yet his mind refused to rest. At last he let his eyes close, drifting into uneasy slumber. In his dream, he stood in the very hall where he had found the living dragon. But the walls were whole, pillars gleaming, braziers alight with ghostly flames. Dragons soared overhead, their roars echoing in triumph. A woman's voice, distant and sorrowful, called his name. He turned, seeing only swirling embers and shadows. He awoke to darkness, the hush of old Valyria pressing in on him like a shroud. There was no going back to the Wall or Winterfell. There was no returning to the Seven Kingdoms, only forward, into the depths of this haunted empire, guided by the flicker of a possibility that both excited and terrified him. He took a steadying breath and imagined a ghost loping beside him. A faithful companion in the gloom. But Ghost was far away, as were any friends he had once known. He was alone, but for the faint heartbeat of a dragon egg, and the memory of a living dragon in the heart of the ruins. Thus began Jon Snow's life in exile, steeped in the mysteries and horrors of old Valyria. With each step he took into the city's broken streets, he carried not only the weight of his own past, but the future of a creature who should not exist, and perhaps the faint glimmer of a destiny he had long tried to forsake. Perhaps the gods were not done with him after all, or perhaps it was the old magic of Valyria awakening once more, choosing its champion. He could almost feel the power in the air, electric against his skin, stirring his Targaryen blood in a way the cold of the north never had. Before him lay a labyrinth of nightmares and wonders, deserted halls and hidden caverns, secrets steeped in the fire of draconic might. The path ahead was unclear, yet he sensed that every choice he made would reverberate through the tapestry of fate. Jon Snow drew Longclaw and laid it across his knees, gazing at the rippled pattern of the Valyrian steel. The sword had served him well, and it was born of this land's molten heart. Now, he was returned to that source, and an unknown future awaited. If the night was merciful, it would grant him enough rest to face what the dawn might bring. If not, then he would guard the egg with his life, for better or worse. He closed his eyes, feeling the slow, rhythmic beat of his own heart, trying to find the calm within the maelstrom of thoughts. Far below, in the bowels of old Valyria, something rumbled again, like a great beast shifting in slumber. Perhaps it was the volcanoes, or the dragons, or the cursed spirits of an empire that would not truly die. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw. Out here, alone in the gloom, only his resolve stood between him and oblivion. He would endure, as he had always endured, for he was Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, the White Wolf who had cheated death, the reluctant Targaryen who had forsaken the throne. He bowed his head, ignoring the tears that pricked at the corners of his eyes. Farewell, Winterfell. Farewell, those he had loved and lost. This was his world now, a place of ancient ruin and hidden fire. His breath shuddered in and out. He let the hush embrace him, sank into the darkness, and prayed to the old gods and the new that he would not awaken to a worse nightmare. But deep down, a tiny spark of wonder glowed, for dragons yet lived in old Valyria, and he, of all people, had stumbled upon them. He did not know what the morrow would bring, only that a bond existed between his blood and those legendary creatures, one that transcended time and doom. If fate willed it, he might bring the dragons back into the world again. If fate willed it, he might learn their secrets and perhaps redeem his haunted past. Or, if the city's curses proved too strong, if the illusions of grandeur once more led to destruction, he might perish here, yet another pale ghost lost among the bones of an empire long dead. The night deepened, and somewhere in the distance, there was a single echoing roar that shook the stones. Jon's eyes flew open, a shock of adrenaline surging through him. He listened, every fiber of his being electrified. But the roar did not repeat. Maybe it was a trick of his dreaming mind. Maybe it was that living dragon calling out. Slowly he let his eyes close again, one hand on Longclaw's hilt, the other covering the wrapped egg, guarding it like a fragile secret of hope. In the silence, old Valyria breathed, and Jon Snow waited for the dawn. Continue the story, 3,000 words. No subtitles. Write narrative script, only no subtitles.